This video is about gastric secretions. So let's first take a look at where the secretions come from. Here we're looking into the lumen of the stomach, and you can see that the lining of the stomach is thrown into all of these convoluted folds called rugae. At this gross level, we can't see where the gastric secretion is coming from, so let's increase the magnification on the rugae. Taking a closer look at the gastric mucosa, we can see that the mucosa is filled with these tiny openings. These are pore-like openings that are called gastric pits, and this is where the gastric secretion comes from. Taking a closer look at the gastric pit, we can see that this gastric pit is leading into two deeper regions. These regions are known as gastric glands. Here's one gastric gland, and here's another gastric gland. So a gastric pit could lead into more than one gastric gland, or a gastric pit could lead into a singular gastric gland, but a gastric gland is made up of secretory cells that produce the gastric juice. The gastric pit just conveys that secretion onto the surface. You might notice that the cells inside of the gastric glands are color-coded on this diagram, and that's because the gastric glands contain 4 different cell types. 3 of those cell types are exocrine in function, and then 1 of those cell types is an endocrine cell. So let's take a look at the 3 cell types that are exocrine first, and then we'll look at the endocrine cell. The dark pink cells up at the proximal end of the gastric gland are mucous neck cells. The mucous neck cells secrete mucus. Another type of cell found in the gastric gland are chief cells. Chief cells are color-coded purple here, and you can see that they're found deep within the gastric glands. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. The reason that an inactive form of an enzyme is secreted by the chief cells is because the active form digests protein, in which case it would actually digest the cell in which it was produced. And so all protein digesting enzymes are secreted in their inactive form, known as a zymogen. The third type of exocrine cell type found in the gastric glands are parietal cells, color-coded blue in this picture. Parietal cells have 2 secretions. One is hydrochloric acid. It's hydrochloric acid that converts the pepsinogen from its inactive form into the active protein digesting enzyme called pepsin. Parietal cells also secrete intrinsic factor, which binds to vitamin B12 in the stomach. Vitamin B12 is important in red blood cell production. It isn't absorbed until it reaches the small intestine, but it must be bound to intrinsic factor by that point. So to summarize, all of the secretions that come from all of the exocrine cells in the gastric glands release their secretions all together, and the sum of that is what's known as gastric juice. Gastric juice contains mucus, pepsin, hydrochloric acid, and intrinsic factor. Here's another summary in writing, just in case this helps, of the cell types found in the gastric glands, the exocrine cell types, the secretions that they produce, and what those secretions are doing. Let's finish by turning our attention to the one cell type in the gastric glands that is an endocrine type of cell. The endocrine cell types are called G cells, or enteroendocrine cells. They're located at the base of the gastric glands, and they're color-coded green in this diagram. Because G cells are endocrine cells, they secrete a hormone. That hormone is called gastrin, and of course hormones are secreted into the blood. Let's just think about that for a minute. All I did here is I took the diagram of the gastric glands that we've been looking at, and I rotated it 90 degrees clockwise. That's because I wanted to show how the gastric pits are opening into the lumen of the stomach. And so we know the exocrine cell types are producing gastric juice. In other words, the mucous neck cells are releasing mucus, that's part of the gastric juice. The parietal cells are releasing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, and the chief cells are secreting pepsinogen, and that pepsinogen is being activated by the hydrochloric acid in the lumen of the stomach. But all of that is a gastric exocrine secretion that we call gastric juice. The G cells, on the other hand, found at the base of the gastric gland, secrete a hormone. Hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, and so G cells are secreting hormones into the blood vessels of the lamina propria, and that hormone is traveling through the blood to its target tissue. The target tissue of gastrin are the gastric glands. Gastrin stimulates secretion from the gastric glands.